we have Nathan Lowder. He is from the USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture's National Natural Resource and Conservation Service. And so I'm going to let him finish introducing himself, and then Nathan, you can get started with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Janelle, and appreciate the opportunity to present to y'all this afternoon. And as Janelle said, my name's Nathan Lowder. I work with NRCS, which is Natural Resource Conservation Service. And in 2015, they actually started the Soil Health Division. So NRCS is an agency within USDA where producers, for the most part, would have interaction with local staff at a county level. So some NRCS folks may cover multiple counties, but a lot of times those collaborations of NRCS are with soil and water districts and likely in the same building as extension folks. A lot of times, not always the case, but usually you can find all of these people in the same office building for a county service. So what does NRCS do? So NRCS is an agency that helps producers implement best management practices on working lands across the nation. And they can do that either through some type of federal programs or possibly even through just conservation technical assistance. Say a producer comes in and just wants some information about a pond or about pollinators or about cover crops or some type of reduced tillage. And NRCS has a lot of those information that can then be given to those producers to implement or help them implement that on their land. And then once you can actually develop a conservation plan through either the Soil and Water District or the NRCS office, then those plans would actually outline those BMPs that you may want to implement on your land. And then it may elaborate more on potential avenues or programs that could assist those producers to implement those BMPs. And then all of our programs are voluntary, so that's a great thing. So you can just take the CTA, the technical assistance information, or you can proceed further for some type of assistance through one of the federal programs. So with the NRCS Soil Health Division, I came on with that in 2015. I actually started in Georgia South, Georgia all the way to Puerto Rico. As folks have retired, I have accumulated from North Carolina to Puerto Rico. Other retirements, I am now currently all the way from Maine to Puerto Rico currently. However, we got some vacancies that are going to be filled here in the very near future, which is going to hopefully help me scale back to some extent, back maybe to that possible original area plus a state or two. And my entire mission is to assist NRCS, soil and water districts, other conservation-minded entities with progressing soil health across the nation. So I don't administer programs. I don't do anything to that effect. I'm just there to either train NRCS staff or assist our partners, conservation partners, with promoting soil health and how we can do that. And the thing I'm going to talk with y'all today about is cover crop management. And there's cover crops is just, we could likely spend a training event of multiple days just talking about cover crops. But I'm going to try to dwindle that down into 34 minutes if I can, somehow, some way. And if this sparks a lot of interest and a lot of questions, then reach out to Janelle and maybe she'll ask me to come back, or maybe not. So we'll see what happens. So when we think about cover crop purposes, when I mentioned that we outline BMPs, we're not only outlining BMPs, but we're looking at resource concerns on the land. So that could be something like poor soil health. It could be erosion, could be water quality, could be lack of habitat for wildlife. And there's just a lot of different things that we could utilize different conservation practices to address those resource concerns. Yet also we have to really focus on those resource concerns and then the producer's objectives. So across North Carolina, you may have producers that have a lot of the same cropping systems, but how they approach those production systems and what their intent or objectives are is likely going to be different. So when we think about conservation practices, a lot of those are singular focused. So maybe a grass waterway addresses erosion, or a field border addresses wildlife habitat. A conservation practice like cover crop just provides tremendous opportunities to not only address a lot of resource concerns, but also a lot of objectives that producers may have. And some of those are listed here on the screen: crop diversity, habitat, soil surface armor, preventing erosion, building stable soil aggregates, which is something very, very important, improving the water cycle and making more water available for the crops that we're trying to grow, integrated pest management, or providing a habitat for beneficial insects, using cover crops to build or improve soil organic matter, which could also lead to improved nutrient cycling and efficiency. We could use cover crops for air quality. We could use them to adjust seed-in ratios, or those carbon to nitrogen ratios. We could also use cover crops to provide wildlife winter food and shelter. We could use them for livestock integration. And lastly, and the last one we're going to look at here, is possibly fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere by integrating some legume cover crops into our production systems. And this is somewhat of a long list, but there are likely more resource concerns that we could address, and also, more importantly, objectives that we could address that producers have as well. Some things we need to think about as planners and also producers is think about how we can be successful in planning for the use of these cover crops. So things like site preparation, early weed control, timing and species, to make sure that we have adequate growing season when we're intending to plant that cover crop. It could be, well, we'll get into that into a slide here in a second. But we just want to make sure that we have time for that cover crop to grow, to get the benefit that we're looking for. We could also use cover crops to add diversity to our cropping rotations. We'll also take actually a slide or two to look at seed quality. We'll look at bin run, PLS, certified seed, a lot of different sources that we could utilize for actually sourcing these cover crops that we would use. We'll also look and spend a little bit of time on seeding methods, looking at seed to soil contact, talk about drilling versus broadcasting the seed, or maybe some other inventive or innovative ways to actually get cover crops out there. We'll also talk about seed size and seeding depth, legume inoculation, and also some moisture management benefits that we could utilize or consider in selecting different cover crop species. So we have to think about what is our seeding time frame, and as diverse as North Carolina is, we may be a corn, wheat, soybean rotation, we may be a corn, cotton, we may be continuous cotton, we may be vegetables, we may be a high tunnel, we may be perennial, we may be a pasture system. There's just a lot of different diverse systems as far as ag production systems that are across North Carolina. So we could see that there could be many different times that we could actually have an opportunity to plant cover crops. So things like spring, early summer, late summer, fall, and there could be other windows other than these four that I've listed here above. And what we mostly see in North Carolina is that a lot of cover crops are usually planted in the fall. However, when you get into some of those vegetable systems, or maybe some smaller scale niche markets, where those systems have kind of off-season planting dates, we can see that some of these other timeframes may work as well. So other windows is very possible in these situations. So I want you to think about how cover crops address soil health. And I mentioned that cover crops could be used for wildlife habitat. I want to focus more on the importance of habitat for soil biology. And soil biology is something that we have maybe not given a tremendous amount of credit in the past. As producers, we may be overly focused on the above ground biomass of either a forage or the cash crop that we're trying to grow. But we need to think about all of or the multitude of things that are actually happening at and below the soil surface. And we can see some graphics here, A, B, C, and D. Let's see, does this have a pointer? Maybe not. Maybe not a pointer. So I'll just bear with me on the A, B, and C, and D.
We can see your mouse moving.
You can see my mouse.
Arrow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So we're here at A, and this is showing missed opportunities for providing ecosystem services. So I want you to understand that living roots provide a transport or communication from above ground growth to soil biology. And I like to use the analogy that the area around a root is called this fancy word called the rhizosphere. But me coming from a farming background, and I understand that the root is where soil biology feeds for the most part, I like to think of it as a feed trough. So if I'm wanting to supply and promote that soil biology, I got to feed it. So it takes living roots to do that. And when we're feeding and supporting that biology, then we're providing ecosystem services. So A is showing that we do not have a cover crop on the spring or fall of this annual grain crop system. So that's annual grain crop. That could be vegetables. It could be anything that is putting living roots. So it's providing those ecosystem services there. But when we don't have a cover crop, we're asking that soil biology to go hungry for the most part. Of course, it's not going to go completely hungry. It's going to consume itself. It's going to feed on, build up residues in the soil surface, consume organic matters, and things like that. So it could actually degrade our soil or degrade the health of the soil as well. So moving to B, we actually incorporate a cover crop after our actual annual grain crop, post-harvest drilled. After that harvest, they seed that in, and it goes through the winter, comes into spring. We see this little spike in growth, but then we terminate that cover. And then we have a small gap of time on the front and back end of our annual grain crop, but we are providing some limited ecosystem services. So how can we take this a step further and improve it? Because we want to try to overlap and have continuous living roots throughout the entire year. And that's where perennial systems really thrive and can make huge huge inroads on building or changing the health of the soil with perennial systems because of live living roots. But C is actually planting that same cover crop after the annual grain crop, but this producer is actually letting that cover crop grow longer and actually plants the annual grain crop into living cover. So they're planting green, and then that cover crop is terminated then. So we have that continuity or that continuous living root going into that grain production. But we're missing out at the as that annual grain crop is becoming mature and starting to die off prior to harvest, that we're missing some of those exudates or those substances leaking out of those living roots from that annual grain crop. So we still have an opportunity that we're missing some of those ecosystem services. So how can we fix that on the back end? And well, we can interseed a cover crop, and that's illustrated by D down here. So we actually came into that annual grain crop and seeded that cover crop. So this could be something like if you have vegetables, you could, they're starting to slow down. You actually could go in and broadcast cover crops into that stand of vegetables. Or if it's a grain system or maybe cotton, and that could be done as leaf drop of soybeans, or as maybe cotton would be defoliated. So there's multiple opportunities, and some producers, even with short growing seasons, actually have developed innovative ways to where they can actually go in taller crops and seed those cover crops. And I really think that there is a potential to have an E graphic here as well, where C and D is combined. You have a producer that may plant green, have their annual grain crop, and then also interseed cover crops. And that would be the greatest system, or that'd be the greatest cropping system to provide ecosystem services, because they would have living roots just about through that entire cropping season. So we have to think about cover crops because we want them to complement our current cropping system, and we want to make sure that they're not going to pose a problem. And we also have to think back to those resource concerns and the producer's objectives. And usually we can plan for what we don't have. So things like growth cycle of those cover crops, is it an annual, perennial, biennial? The growth habit, does it climb? Does it run across the ground? Root architectures, is it fibrous roots? Is it a taproot? Think about the growth rates. Once these things are seeded, are they really vigorous and come out of the ground, or are they slow starters? Things like chemical composition. Do we need that cover crop to actually provide some type of chemical composition to help us offset, say, a weed or say a pest that we're trying to combat in our existing system? Things like stress tolerance. When would those cover crops be planted, and what may they endure? May it be a very wet period of time in the cropping system, or could it be a very dry time of that cropping system? Because we actually need to keep that in mind for our management, because if they're flower, they're going to make viable seed potentially. So we need to know how to manage those. We also want to make sure that cover crops that we select are not pathways for pests to go from our cash crops onto our cover crop and be a host, and then easily just transmit it or provide that habitat for that pest to go through the entire season and then back onto the next cash crop. So we want to make sure that we keep those things in mind and considered when selecting different species. So when we think about resources for selecting different cover crops and trying to find out some of that information that I just listed there on the last slide, we have to think about what are those resources. This is an actual cover crop chart that was developed by ARS. This is one of our sister agencies within USDA. And this one actually gives you a lot of information, and it's interactive because you can actually download this for free. You can use a search engine on the internet, ARS cover crop chart, allow it to download. And when you click on these different species, it's going to give you not only pictures, but it would also give you information that is listed like up here at the above. It would give you that growth cycle. It would give you that plant architecture, and also give you relative water use. These are also broken down into cool season, warm season, broadleafs, grasses, and also if they are a legume or a grass, as I mentioned there earlier. So these are just one resource. There's a lot of other resources there on the web, and if I can get through this presentation, I'll have a listing of some of those near the end. So things about this is some examples of cool season grasses that we commonly use in the Southeast. Things like annual ryegrass, cereal rye, barley, oats, wheat, triticale, all the small grains are very commonly used. I would say that probably the most widely used would be cereal rye. In this instance, it provides a tremendous amount of biomass and is very easy to terminate. And on the other hand, just the totally opposite of that is annual ryegrass. So this could work in some situations. I have a tendency to use annual ryegrass in grazing systems if it's going to be used in an annual in maybe some different paddocks that you're utilizing for seasonal grazing. But most production systems where you have either vegetables or row crops don't want to use annual ryegrass, just because it is a prolific reseeder, and it is also becoming more and more potentially herbicide resistant. I would say if you're going to use annual ryegrass, that you very much make sure you know what you're buying, that you're buying a certified seed source, and that you are very confident in that, and you would be more likely to be able to control it rather than buying maybe something that is variety not stated, annual ryegrass. So you typically don't know what is in that bag other than annual ryegrass. So it could actually contain some seeds that could be herbicide resistant. Warm season grasses, these are some great choices. A lot of times this could fit in your vegetable production systems. If you have cool season vegetables, these actually provide a tremendous amount of growth in a short period of time. Things like pearl millet, Japanese millet, sorghum Sudan grass, forage sorghum, teff. And a lot of these have actually been bred if you wanted to include them in not only cropping systems, but also utilize them for some type of forage. A lot of them have been bred or have some varieties that are forage based. So there's a emphasis put on that above ground forage growth or wider leaves to supplement forage or supplement grazing for livestock animals. Cool season broadleaves, radishes, turnips, rape, kale, collards, mustards, phacelia. And if you're a vegetable producer, you may be thinking, well, this could be my cash crop. And that is definitely something you would want to take into consideration before using these. And how would they complement or fit in your existing crop production system? But row crop producers and also livestock producers do find benefit by utilizing some of these species in their mixes, not only for use of scavenging nutrients that may be left over from past crops, but also helping to maybe alleviate some compaction, or the brassicas in general could actually have, back to that chemical composition, they may have some natural biofumigant properties that could help combat some of those pests that we may find in that soil profile. We'll actually talk a little bit more about some of these brassica families here in just a second. Because we need to know how and when cover crops are going to actually produce viable seed. And a lot of times that comes to this brassica family, because cover crops could become a serious weed problem. And I'm not going to say that this is only focused on brassicas. This could be focused on anything that we're growing. And it boils down to the management, because if we allow any plant in our production systems to go to and make viable seed, then of course we could see that viable seed germinate in next year's crop. It doesn't matter what it is. So again, corn and soybeans could be a weed, or corn in a cotton field could be a weed, or tomatoes in okra could be a weed. It's all about the management of the species that we're using, not only cover crops but cash crops. And some things to take into consideration are things like the radishes are photoperiod sensitive. So if we plant them in a time where we have those longer days, they're going to set seed. So we have to know that. Is it okay to use them? Yes. But know how and when they're going to produce seed so that we can get those terminated. Mustards are going to accumulate those growing degree days. So they're going to bloom usually 30 to 60 days after planting. So we need to have that management in place to where we get those terminated before they make that viable seed. Address the benefit that we're looking, or the objective that we're looking to address, by utilizing that species, and then get them terminated. Things like turnips, kale, collards, cabbage, rapeseed are going to require vernalization. Some of our cool season cereal grains also require vernalization, just depending on if they're a fall planted or a spring planted. So if they have to have that cold treatment for that plant to go through before they are triggered to set seed. So there's cover crops may seem like a very simplistic thing to do. Yeah, I'm just going to plant some cover crops, but we need to think as managers of our existing systems. We need to take several things into consideration. Warm season broadleaves, we could utilize things like buckwheat, safflower, sunflower. So these not only could be actual crops, but we could utilize these different species to provide those benefits or meet those objectives. Because a lot of these, like sunflower, safflower, could have extreme pollinator benefits. Also, the buckwheat could have pollinator benefits. And things like buckwheat could actually help us, for lack of better words, unlock some of those tied up nutrients that could be bound to soil particles, things like phosphorus. Buckwheat has that capability when utilized. Cool season legumes, I'm going to say that these are likely a staple that could be combined with one of those cool season cereal grains that we mentioned earlier. Things like vetch, crimson clover, perennial clovers could be used, or things like Austrian winter pea. We have example here at the bottom left of vetch. Here is your perennial clovers, like a white clover looks like. To the right, we have some cowpeas or winter peas. And top right is crimson clover. So winter pea does have I guess you could say, a cousin that would be warm season, which is those cowpeas that I mentioned. And I think that is actually coming up here in this slide. So warm season legumes, things like those cowpeas, bottom right. Soybean, also kind of cousin, could resemble those in the bottom right. Things like sun hemp. Now, sun hemp is in some states considered a noxious weed or invasive species just because of the family that it comes from. However, I think in North Carolina it's not listed either way, and producers are very open and adamant about using things like sun hemp. And you may say, well, why do I want to use sun hemp? Well, it has some great uh, positive benefits. It gets a tremendous amount of growth in a short period of time, and it being a legume could fix a tremendous amount of nitrogen in a short period of time. And you could also graze animals on this as well. So there is a lot of benefits. Some other things that may be utilized could be things like chickpea or even mung bean. And while I have just a listing here of 5, if we think back to that cover crop chart or other cover crop resources, there are probably multiple more that could be utilized as well. I'm just trying to give you some examples here of these different species or different functional groups. So if we're going to utilize legumes of any way, whether they be cool season or warm season, it's very important that we use the correct inoculant, because some of these species may have never been introduced on the land that you're wanting to utilize them, especially something like sun hemp or maybe mung bean or chickpeas. We've commonly had the common peas in gardens, or common things like soybeans in our crop production systems that have likely been on a lot of different land across the state. But when we start including those other species, we have to make sure that we provide that bacteria, because a lot of times these legumes are actually pretty pricey. So we want to make sure that they're going to do what we intend on them to do. Not only provide some diversity, but also be able to fix that nitrogen from the atmosphere. So some producers may opt to use seed that they have actually grown, and that can be very utilized, because that may be a very economical way to get a cover crop out on the land. But this picture that you're seeing here could be an actual example of what a producer may be trying to seed, coming straight out of a bin. So you may think, well, that is doable, but we have to think about how are we going to seed it, and what are some minimum things that we would need to do before we use this seed. And I would just mention that it would need to be cleaned. You would want to do some type of germination check on it. And those are 2 very, very common things that would need to be done before you utilized it as seed. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to send that off to one of the state testing labs, to where you can get a good germination, to make sure that you know, in as far as selecting your seeding rate, how much you would need to add to hit your target rate. So this is just a seed tag, and excuse me. Before I go through a lot of these different calculations, we have to think about seed tags are going to give us a lot of different information. It's going to tell us if it's certified. It's going to tell if it's VNS, which is variety not stated. And what we can also figure is something called pure live seed, or PLS. But a lot of times when you encounter vendors or conservation planners or extension personnel, a lot of times they think in terms of pounds per acre. So actually, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on pure live seed, because you would want to consult your seed tag, because in this example, as you can see that just populated on the screen, when we think about PLS, is this bag could be somewhat misleading, because this is a 50-pound bag. Let's say we need 10 pounds to the acre to meet a seeding rate requirement. And I'm just going to do quick tailgate math. Well, 10 pounds to acre, I can seed 5 acres with this 50-pound bag. But that's really not the case when I take in a consideration of the pure seed, the germination, and I come up with actually I need 16.9 pounds of bag or seed from this bag to get that 10-pound per acre seeding rate, which, does raise some red flags. And the seeding tag actually gives you that information because this bag is only 65% pure seed. We have to think, well, where's the rest of the bag? Well, the seed tag shows us that 30% of it is coating material. So a lot of, there's some things we need to think of, and also looking at the germination, hard seed, different factors that we need to take into account before we order our seed. So just make sure we review those seed tags. Cultivars may vary. Producers may have different objectives, and I'm just going to spend just a second here. Let's look at daikon radishes. Those were very, very popular and had a lot of interest from producers. And you may have to think back to what is the objective? Does that person have or producer have compaction issues? So they may use a variety like Ecotil or Driller or Sodbuster, while some producers may have nematode problems. They may use something like Control or Defender. And then you have another producer that wants to graze these radishes. So something like Lunch or Graza. So we can just see that all varieties are not created equal. So they may have been bred for different things. And that could come into account for things like cereal rye. The biggest thing there is the maturity of those. When they mature, Florida 401 is one that matures very, very early in comparison to something that is very common like a bruisey rye. You could probably see easily a month or more difference between the maturity of those two different varieties of cereal rye. So just keep that in mind as well. So here, let's get to something a little bit more, I'm going to say maybe interested is, producers are accustomed to seeding, monoculture species, either seeding corn, beans, vegetables. But when we're thinking about a cover crop or even a diverse cover crop, we have to think about how are we going to seed that? And you see a picture here of a warm season mix that was in my hand. I actually seeded some of this on pasture land and also in some of our cropland last summer. We can see things like sun hemp here. We see some grain sorghum, millets, sunflowers. There is some buckwheat in here. I want to say there's multiple other things in here as well. And we have to think, well, dang, we got different seed size. They need to be seeded at different depths. And how am I going to say I need 50 pounds of this mix seeded? How in the world am I going to calibrate for 50 pounds to the acre of this mix? So, thinking about that is what I commonly do is for this warm season mix that I look at the grass species. And for this case, it was actually the sorghum or milo that was in this mix that was the major grass component. And I utilize seeding tables for that grass species to give me a good starting point to reach the total pounds of acres or total pounds per acre that I'm looking to put out of this mix. So if I want 50 pounds of this mix, I go to the seeding rate. 50 pounds per acre of grain sorghum or milo is this drill setting. I put in a predetermined amount of seed, go seed that, and then check my seed box to see if it is coming out about right. Or you could be even more specific about that and jack the drill up, run through its calibration procedure, catch that seed, weigh it. If you wanted to get super specific, separate all those seed out, weigh them to see if you're getting what proportion or what percentage of the mix that you're wanting to do. I usually don't opt to get that detailed or specific. I usually just shoot from the hip to some extent and go from there. I always do make not measurements. I do record my drill settings in my drill or my broadcaster or my notes book. That way I don't have to do this every year, because a lot of times in our cropping system, we use the same cover crop mix every year, same components, same percentages. So I just go back to that setting and I'm good to go. Save several hours of trying to calibrate every year. So how are we going to seed it? Of course, we could drill it. I do get a a conversation from producers saying this is the most time consuming, which it could be. They do also say that it's the most expensive, and we could debate that. $16 to $18 per acre is going to provide row plant spacing, consistent results, and good seed to soil contact. You can see here that actual operation of drilling. Some of the results here you can see coming up. And there also is producers that will say, well, if I have this seeding mix, all of those small seed are going to just settle out and come out at the beginning of my planting operation. And I used to think that myself. However, what we have noticed in doing multiple years of this is we actually find that the more seeds that we have in these mixes actually creates a more stable mix, and those seed have a tendency to stay suspended in that different mix. And also, if you'll take and look at the densities of these different seeds, a lot of time you will find that they are very close. And I'm not going to say these verbatim, but let's just say the grain sorghums and the millets may have a very, very close density in comparison to the sunflower or the buckwheat or the sun hemp mix as well. So this is the picture of the bottom of a drill box where I seeded this mix. That drill box was full. It held about 70 bushels of seed. Here at the end, you can see it's all the way down to the bottom, and you can still see all of those same species. You can count for every one of them. Even some of those very small seeds are still there in suspension in that seeding mix. So other ways that we could seed it, producers may have existing pieces of equipment on the farm, and they may want to utilize that, which is great. They may either broadcast that out ahead, use some type of very, very minimal disturbance to scratch that in, or they could opt to put some type of additional piece of or an accessory on that piece of equipment. You can see a picture here where an air box or a Gandy box was added to this Phoenix. No, this is actually a Phillips tool or Phillips harrow that just rolls across the soil surface and kind of rakes or incorporates those seed into the residue on top of the soil surface. You may be asking, well, what is an air box or a Gandy box? So this is a seed hopper and is utilizing a fan to transport those seed out to diffuser plates in front of this light incorporation of this implement. So it's spreading the seed out on the residue. The piece of equipment disturbs those residues and gets those covered to aid in germination. So these are popular by some producers. You can also see an air box that was added to a vertical tillage rig here. They like them because they're fast. They usually can cover a tremendous amount of ground in a short period of time, which if a producer is larger in scale, they can cover a lot of acres in a day's time. But cheap. They do mention that, man, that's cheap. I can do it. However, $17.30 an acre for the vertical tillage, and then $12.50 an acre for the broadcasting if it has to be done in a separate pass. So maybe not as cheap as those producers were thinking. It does provide random plant spacing, and if we're thinking about trying to minimizing disturbance in our operations to fast track or improve soil health at a greater pace, this method is going to have some soil disturbance. So it may be going against minimizing that soil disturbance, soil health principle. Some producers opt to fly it on, or actually you could also relate broadcasting this on using a whirlybird or some type of cement spreader, or getting the local co-op with a high boy to come in and actually spread this on. This could also be comparable to a producer using a front-mounted or a ATV pulled broadcaster or seeding by hand. But broadcasting this on to a crop or onto land after harvest has already taken place. Of course, if we fly it on, it could be fast. $12 to $18 per acre is what it costs to get done. Any of the broadcasting methods are going to provide that random plant spacing. We're not guaranteeing seed to soil contact. And when we broadcast in any shape, form, or fashion, we need to increase those seeding rates at least by 30%, just because we're not guaranteeing that seed to soil contact. And if we're going to utilize this method, we want to pray for rain to where we can hopefully get our aid in germination of that cover crop. Let's see. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this. These are some examples. These were broadcast into standing soybeans. You can see the cover crop has started there. The crop has senesced, harvest, and then it releases that crop. This was planted into a standing corn crop. You can see the cover crop has germinated there. And once the, well, I have actually a picture here. This is a picture from an innovative producer that utilized a high boy spreader to actually go in standing higher crops and using that same air delivery to broadcast those seed into that standing crop. Some producers may utilize existing operations. So if they're harvesting, well, I'm going to harvest and I'm going to seed my cover crop at the same time. Again, utilizing an air box. This is a picture of a corn header. It could also be adapted to a platform header to where it's delivering those seed right behind that harvest operation. And then the combine actually distributes chaff on top of those seed to cover those and aid in germination. You can see some results there. This one is from up in Indiana, where they have annual ryegrass and some type of annual clover that is coming up there. So these are some these are local examples here where producers actually wanted to defoliate cotton and spread their cover crop seed at the same time. They actually utilized putting those spreaders on the front and on the back of different spraying equipment. And then we can see here that they're actually defoliating that cotton. You know, they're stopping the growth of that, knocking the leaves off, and also you can see on the front of there, they're spreading that cover crop seed out as they're doing that. So the leaves will fall off of that cotton and cover those seed and aid in germination. Some producers may utilize existing planting equipment that they have. With newer equipment, they could actually source maybe some very comparable seed plates to where they could seed that cover crop mixes. They may actually utilize alternating hoppers to where they could seed different species on different rows if they're targeting or have a specific objective. We have very precision placement and very, very consistent results of this. We can utilize this at somewhere around $12 to $18 per acre, utilizing that on-farm equipment. You can see a producer here actually utilize a brassica or radishes on one row alternated by some type of grass on the other. So they may be utilizing that brassica as some type of in-row subsoiling or in-row ripping, where they could actually terminate that brassica or terminate the cover crop in general next spring and plant their cash crop right on that brassica row, while the residue of the grass species would help cover those row middles. Interseeding possibilities. This is actually a commercial piece of equipment that was developed by Penn State that actually comes into row crops like corn. This could be utilized in cotton. This could likely be utilized in some vegetable systems to where they are multitasking by not only planting cover crops, but they also could be doing some type of fertility to the actual cash crop at that time. And things you would need to think about is, of course, maybe some of the herbicides that could be used in these existing systems and how they may impact or complement the seeding of these cover crops. But we could also see that we can get these cover crops started earlier and bridge the gap of having those continuous living roots. This bottom picture here at the right actually shows, of course, corn is just drying down just like it is this time of year. So it's not exuding out those substances to that soil biology, and it's actually letting sunlight get to the ground. So why not have a cover crop there taking advantage and harvesting that sunlight to where we can get a jump start on growth, where I can actually build more residue or more biomass before it goes into the winter months in this area. Some things to think about, advantages and some disadvantages of planting green. And planting green is going into this residue prior to actually terminating it. So some things to think about is if we plant green, we're actually going to enable more biomass or more residue to be accumulated from that cover crop. The spring, in our area here, the first couple weeks of April, cover crop residues could double, triple, quadruple in size just in those few short weeks of April when spring is breaking. So we may have producers that have objectives of, say, weed control. So they want as much residue as they can out there to where it can shade that soil and keep those shallow, small seeded weeds from germinating by intercepting that light with that cover crop residue. Also, when these cover crop residues are standing and green, actually planter performance is really, really optimal because it's not trying to impede a lot of residue that may be laying on the soil surface. Some disadvantages. You could have some pest pressure, potentially, if those pests are prevalent or present. So we would want to take that into consideration. If we have I want to focus on when we plant in cover crop residue. Cover crop residue either needs to be just like this picture, very green, fresh, and crisp, or completely dead, dry, and brittle, and nowhere in between. Because as you can see in this picture, producer is planting into that residue, green and fresh, and likely going to come back and either roller crimp that or apply herbicide. And then that cover crop is going to be breaking down. And it becomes very, very, very tough and hard to plant through. So that's where we could see some of these disadvantages of wrapping around planter drives. Hairpinning. Hairpinning is where instead of cutting that residue, it actually pushes that residue down into the soil surface because it can't cut it because it's so tough. And when we hairpin things, it actually becomes a straw that could actually wick moisture out of the soil profile. Or we could be placing seed directly onto residue and not getting good seed to soil contact. So that could cause some germination issues.
Nathan, I just wanted to let you know we have about 11 minutes. So just
all right.
Where you are.
Thank you, Janelle. I'm going to speed through. I got about just 2 or 3 more slides here I want to touch on. So cover crop termination methods, herbicide burn down, tillage, frost, crimper roller, grazing, shredding, mowing. But a lot of times what we find is producers will use a combination of these above methods. So when do I mentioned cover crops and getting those planted. There's a lot of considerations in making those decisions about what to plant, but we also need to know how we're going to kill that cover crop before we actually plant it, because producers may not be as comfortable in planting in tall residue like that top right picture. So we would want to terminate it maybe on the top left picture, something a lot smaller. So knowing how to terminate that cover crop before we actually plant it is definitely a consideration. Herbicide, I'm not going to spend any time on. Other planting resources, there are things called cover crop councils. Southern Cover Crop Council covers North Carolina. It's composed of land grant universities, industry, other researchers, other entities, conservation groups, and also producers. Look to see a lot of great, valuable resources coming from you can search that on the internet, Southern Cover Crop Council, to take you to a web page. There's already a lot of great, valuable resources on that website. SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education, provides a lot of great publications as well. And there's a lot of various industry cover crop resources out there as well. One thing I want to close with is to remember 4 simple things, and that is the soil health planting principles. And those are listed here in a circle: maximize living roots, minimizing disturbance, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing soil cover. When we can follow all of those soil health planting principles, we are not only feeding that soil biology, but we're also protecting our soils to where they can be super productive and we can build soil health. So, Janelle, I will stop there and be glad to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That was really, really informative. I even was learning quite a bit there. because cover crops is it's a complex thing. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and ask them that way. I have a question about, I guess, if someone is really trying to not utilize, being an organic system, so they're not going to use herbicides, and they use a very diverse cover crop mix. Is roller crimper really the best way to terminate that crop?
So roller crimping can be very successful. The thing you have to think about when roller crimping solely as a termination method is that cover crop has to be pretty far along in maturity. So any of the cereal grains would need to be at soft dough, or multiple passes, maybe alternating paths across that residue, to where it can successfully crimp and break that stem. The small grains are not so bad. Like cereal rye, you could actually likely kill it sooner than soft dough. But some things like wheat or barley, you're going to likely have to let those get to soft dough. And then if you use something like vetch or crimson clover, getting those maturities at the same time could be somewhat complex. Can you successfully kill them? Yes, but they're going to have to be at that stage of maturity.
I got you.
So organic is challenging. So you may have to think about not only roller crimping, you may have to mow or shred, you may have to solarize, you may have to graze, which again leads into some challenges with vegetable crops possibly. So yes, organic and not having tillage does present some challenge. Now, I did not say eliminate disturbance. However, I would love to. I said minimize disturbance. So if we can minimize those disturbance operations, we can still build soil health.
Yes, perhaps something like a silage tarp. If you're doing vegetable crop and you have multiple species, then perhaps a silage tarp out there solarizing it might be the way to terminate the crop. If it's a smaller, I guess you could do that over half an acre or maybe an acre, but I don't think any more than that. Might be a little rough with a silage tarp. And then I've seen people doing minimal disturbance and doing ridge tilling. So they're almost like stacking it up on top of it. So though you're disturbing that, I can see forming the ridges and then planting into the ridge. And then maybe going in with a living mulch.
Yeah, living mulch is fine too. The thing you would need to think about there would be the disturbance that you would have to do to create the row for your actual cash crop, and then leaving the living mulch in between, or solarizing just the furrow basically, if herbicides were not being utilized.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's where it becomes more complex. But certainly worth researching, because often a lot of the farmers that are, especially in Durham County, are smaller. And so they can do things like use a silage tarp because they're not doing, 10 acres or 20 or 30 acres.
Yeah. One termination method that used to be listed on our presentation was flaming. But I have not toyed with that or played with it enough to see how successful. I know there are commercial flamers that are available, but killing maybe residues that are head tall, how would you go about doing that? What residue is left over? That could be a fire hazard. Of course, the green residue is not a problem, but any dry residue that is left over from past crops could present an issue.
Yeah, I think it might be something where you'd have to do, and I've seen some research on this, the flame, is that it doesn't take very much exposure to the heat, but perhaps you do a flail mower in the front and then heat in the back or something like that, where you are just exposing the stuff that's down lower to the ground to the heat. And then maybe perhaps that would work. But I don't know. That's obviously just conjecture at this point. So we actually have a question in the chat. And as I've been hearing a lot about using industrial hemp as a cover crop, do you know of any existing data on best practices or ways to implement that?
Industrial hemp, I do not. That question actually came up in a call last week where they were talking about utilizing hemp as a cover crop. So, unfortunately, I do not have any information at this time, but I could definitely try to find something out.
Yeah.
Usually, the hemp was cost prohibitive to use early on. I'm not certain what transplants are now or going from seed, what those costs would be now, but usually it was cost prohibitive.
Yeah, that would be true. And certainly, I mean, I suppose you could grow it as a cash crop and get the benefits of it growing really well and perhaps helping in some other benefits. I mean, I know that a lot of people use industrial hemp for not just the fibers, but they're using it for biofuel as well because it has so much biomass.
Yeah. So one thing that really comes to mind in using hemp, just because of its fibrous nature, it's going to be likely higher in carbon or have a higher CDN ratio. So I think about what is going to be the end game or the end result of me trying to terminate that, and also maybe plant my cash crop in that.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And then you'd need maybe some legume or something to bump that nitrogen up. Yeah. Because that CDN
And
ratio.
what kind of challenges might that present?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. So we have another question. Can you give some examples of vegetable cash crops to plant green into a cover crop?
So we have actually, I'm going to say that you could likely plant any vegetable into a green cash crop, a green cover crop. We have actually utilized a one row reduced tilled transplanter into heavy cover crops like 6 foot tall rye, crimson vetch that was rolled down and planted directly transplants into that residue. You could think about in terms of I do this in my garden, plant a cover crop, walk it down, and then transplant or direct seed straight into that residue. You could rake it back, hand transplant, rake residues right back around it. And you could direct seed anything that you could put into a planter. I know a lot of times we're thinking of vegetable seed, but if vegetable seed if traditional seed like row crops like corn, soybeans, cotton can be planted in these residues, those direct seed methods of vegetables could happen as well. And transplanter technology has came a long way, and there are multiple manufacturers out there that make reduced till or no till transplanters.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. That's I'm just thinking to myself, like, I wonder how carrots would work because they're just so tiny. But at the initial, when they're first germinating, they don't, they need no light. And then it's just a matter of having enough light when they're really small, so they're not shaded by the residue.
Yep.
So another question is, what is a good resource for cover crop seed for backyard veggie growers? I have about a half an acre of beds and too many to buy in seed packets. So I can let you know depending on where you are, Sarah, certainly if you're in North Carolina and anywhere near Pittsburgh, you can buy all sorts of cover crops from Country Farm and Home. You can get them by the pound. That's where I get my cover crops seed from, because you can just get a pound of this, a half a pound of that. You can mix it up yourself. And then I know if for small gardens, Johnny Seeds does sell multiple mixes, and you can buy that by the larger quantity if you ask for their commercial catalog, or if you go on their website, they have them in various sides. But I don't know if you know anything, Nathan, of where a good sources for
Yep.
Not enough for a 100-acre farmer, but someone that'll stay
A
viable.
a lot of those online vendors, if you just simply search cover crops vendors, it's going to probably pull up a lot of them. And a lot of those don't have minimums. So you could actually build a mix. You could do everything right there, and they'll ship you that bag of seed ready to go as soon as it gets to you.
Oh, nice. And then someone put in the chat that Southern Seeds has Southern Seed exposure. Oh, yes, sells cover crop by the pound as well. I do know that they are out there, I believe in Virginia. The Seed Exchange and then So True Seeds as well. They're out of Asheville. They're kind of associated, or they collaborate. Southern Seed Exposure Seed Exchange. Yeah. All right. Oh, we have another question. Is there a particular mix of cover crop that's best for vegetables?
Cover crop mixes. Vegetables are so diverse. I would say you could easily start with one of the cereal grains, and likely the vetch or a crimson clover. It's just how you have to think about how the species you're going to select is going to fit in your existing system. So there's going to have to be some thought put into, how you're going to actually rotate in different cool season, warm season vegetables, and how that actually fits. So it's hard to give just a generic, boom, here you go, cover crop mix.
Right, for sure. Well, I am going to launch this poll here if I can. No, that's not what I want to do. If I get it to.
As you're doing that, Janelle, I will mention that there is actually going to be a cover crop selector in the near future that will be part of that Southern Cover Crop Council. So it will be available on its webpage, and there will be specifics for vegetable crops, as well as row crops, as well as pasture land as well.
I want to thank you so much for this presentation. You've done. This has been a great presentation.